Welcome to our podcast today on small business horsepower. Your small business horsepower podcast, you can find it wherever you get your podcast. That includes Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I'm telling you, we're very pleased to have today on the program Aron Nathanson. I gave you a little background of how I met this guy. My wife and I went to Thailand. We had to use our vacation club and we went there and we both do a little bit of scuba diving. So I said, let's do this. So we take this boat out like 3 hours to the Phi Islands. Let me tell you something. It's beautiful over there. And we met Aron and he was going to be on our dive. Now, we had a little bit of adventure. Our dive master ended up in the hospital, but that's another story for another time, actually. But we had a great time. We had some tribulations under the water there with the currents, but it all turned out great. We had we'll call it 2.5 spectacular dives. So 3 hours going out there, we were talking to Aron about what he does, and I found him to be very interesting, especially as it relates to small business. So I've asked him to come on the program today. Aron, welcome to the podcast today on Small Business Horsepower.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, that was a great trip. Good diving.
Yeah, we had a good time. Give us a little bit first about your background, and then, we'll get into your latest venture. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. So, the beginning of my career, I worked for really big companies. I worked for Deloitte for a while. I worked for the Italian equivalent of ExxonMobil called ENI. And that just wasn't really satisfying to me. As a younger man, I started a couple of businesses. Like in college, I had a business I made bread for local restaurants. So then I, kind of quit and started along the entrepreneurial path, met some people, smart people, and, started a company that didn't work, started another company that did work. I think sort of failure and success can both be good. The first one was a consulting business, which didn't really fail, but it wasn't really successful. My personal thinking is that companies that rely a lot on services, like on people, are very hard to scale. So, there were two really smart guys, smart professors who started a consulting business, but it's hard to scale that. So it was hard to grow that business.
What kind of companies were they, just to get our audience?
They did consulting in kind of telecommunications and information technology, that space, strategy for telecommunications and information technology. At the time, there was a lot of discussion and kind of lots of activity around pricing, for instance. Like if you recall when cell phones first came out, there were thousands of plans. It was really hard to figure out how much things actually cost and how much people were paying for things. We worked a bit on that. But I find that something like software, because, once you start to sell it, the marginal costs really don't increase too much. And so everything is kind of profit. If it works really, really well. At any rate. So yeah, I kind of, when I was young, got interested in small businesses, but never really put that into my career until, I was in my mid-30s.
So that's your background a little bit. You had a couple businesses that didn't go the way you wanted. Let's talk about how we got started with cricket and this whole thing and how you got into that, because that's the essence of the podcast, correct?
Right. So I had recently sold a successful software company, which was in the analytics space, and I was looking for things to do. I live in Boston. There's a lot of entrepreneurial activity here. I met with a bunch of different people, and the one that seemed most interesting was fantasy sports for cricket. One of the other things, not to change the subject, but one of the other things that I also think is good or important to think about is hitting a home run, or to use the cricket expression, hitting a six is really, really hard to do, but getting a base hit is a lot easier, and base hits can be very gratifying. So, the software company we started was sold for $20 million, not $20 billion. But if it's repeatable, if it's something you can do again, that's a good thing. So I recently sold a software company. I was interested in doing something else. Met a guy who had this idea for fantasy sports. He's a subject matter expert. He worked for a company that did analytics for fantasy sports. And we started a company that does fantasy cricket or fantasy sports focusing on cricket. And the reason I mentioned the sort of, get a base hit rather than hit a home run is that the reason that we're successful, or one of the big reasons that we're successful now, I think, is that cricket in the United States is growing. Okay, there are a lot of people, mostly immigrants, but there are a lot of people who are interested in cricket. But it's not big enough so that the really big players like FanDuel or DraftKings are interested in cricket, because for them it's really expensive to, put anything on their front page, and they expect whatever gets on their front page or their landing page to earn them a lot of money. That probably wouldn't work with cricket. And so that gives us an opportunity to be a niche player and, get a very large share of what may not be a huge market, but because we have a large share, that gives us a lot of good opportunities.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, because I was going to ask that question. Like, you're in America here, and I know you probably have partners overseas, but you're sitting here in Boston. It's one of the things I probably don't like about you being a Jets fan. I have to deal with the Patriots and all that stuff, but that's part of my problem.
I apologize.
But getting back to the essence of this thing, why not? I think I asked you on that boat, like, why not go after football, American football and baseball and all this other horse racing and all this stuff? How did you choose cricket? And I guess that's what you're referring to about a base hit over a home run, is how to get on first base. Maybe these guys with all these other sports are already on second and third base, correct? I mean, that's
right. If it had been 15 or 20 years ago or 15 years ago, then football, baseball, certainly in the United States, would be the right thing to chase after basketball. But it isn't 15 or 20 years ago. And I think, one of the other things that's really important when thinking about startups and entrepreneurial activity is timing, because timing is hugely important, right? Like, there was a company that did what Netflix does now before Netflix was around, but there was no fast internet. And so the quality was horrible and they weren't successful. Part of what makes Netflix successful, or made them successful, is the fact that there was good connectivity when they started to do streaming, and now everybody's doing streaming. Now it's a hard market to get into, right? So you have to be at the right moment. And for us, I think actually, kind of talking to that with respect to cricket, it is a good moment because, for instance, the Cricket World Cup was held in the United States last year. Not many people maybe will know that, but that's true. They started a professional cricket league in the United States after many, many years of not having a professional cricket league. And so, at least, on paper, it looks like cricket will continue to expand in the United States. Obviously, there'll be bumps along the road, but it does feel like it's going to become more and more important, and that's going to help us a lot.
Get into the nuts and bolts of this operation. Is most of your clientele in the United States, cricket players, or you have bettors coming from the places where cricket has really been a lifelong game? I mean, like South Africa, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Like, do you have a lot of bettors coming from those quadrants?
Right. So we're active. Our app is available in certain states in the United States where fantasy sports are legal, and some places where we have licenses, some places do not require licenses. We're active in Canada, and we're active in the UK, where we also have a license. Most of our players are either immigrants who are immigrants from India to the United States, Canada, or the UK, or, they are children of immigrants. I would say that probably represents 85% of our players are children of immigrants or children of immigrants from India specifically. There are Pakistanis, there are people from the UK in the United States. There are New Zealanders, there are some, but that's a small minority.
Yeah, but I guess my question, I understand that, but I guess my question is this app, like, if I live in New Zealand right now, can I use this app in New Zealand and make a bet on New Zealand cricket or Indian cricket?
No, that wouldn't be legal. And the app it's geo fenced. We take the GPS from, it's only an app, so it only works on mobile devices, and we take the GPS information from the mobile device, compare it to locations where we are allowed to operate, and if you're not in one of those locations, you can't play. The app won't work.
Is it hard to get that app allowed to operate in countries like India, Pakistan, New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, every country has their. I don't think fantasy sports or gambling are legal at all in Pakistan. fantasy sports are legal in India, but you need a license, which we do not have, and we don't operate in India. But theoretically we could do that if we wanted to. We actually were active in India for a while, but the problem with India, at least for us, is that you may have a large wallet share, but the wallets themselves are relatively small. So in the United States, if a player has $200 or $300 of disposable income a month, a player in India might have $4 or $5 of disposable income a month, and so the volume of players you need in order to be profitable is extremely large. That in turn means that you're developing technology, which is a lot more expensive.
All right, well, then let me get into a small business question. How do you scale this kind of business given the licensing limitations, the different countries where you may or may not be able to operate, or even if you can operate, the dollars aren't there? So you're guiding it toward the US, or so how do you scale what you're doing? Do you add another sport? Do you do more marketing to get more players? What's your vision on this?
Right. So the number one thing is new geographies where wallets are larger. So Australia, for instance, is a geography we're looking at. We may enter that market. We haven't really decided yet 100%, but that's something to look at. We entered the UK about a year and a half ago, so that's relatively new for us, and we're still growing, faster in the UK relative to other geographies. The other way to scale is, spend more on finding customers. So marketing and essentially, because we feel like there are a lot of people that we are not reaching yet. So we think certainly in the UK, for instance, and in certain geographies in the US, like areas where where there's a big Indian diaspora. So New Jersey, for instance, or that part of, New York, that area, Illinois. At any rate, there are certain geographies, excuse me, where we think we're not reaching everybody that we could be reaching. But so those are the two main ways that we think that we should be scaling. Others, adding additional sports probably means moving away from our core customer base. So that's probably not something that we want to do. A lot of our company is oriented towards those customers. So just as an example, we sometimes run ads in other languages, but the other language is always Hindi. And we kind of try to tailor our message to people who are from South Asia, but India specifically.
Right. So if you wanted to add another sport, then it's almost like a different division. You'd have to start up to say, okay, I want to chase golf or whatever, lacrosse. Then you have a whole different type of fan base that will be different than the Indian fan base. So that makes it, interesting how you do that.
Yeah, you have to make choices also, and decide that you're not going to do certain things as opposed to you are going to do certain things. So we were looking, in fact, at creating a whole new, the app would have used the same software, but a completely newly branded app, which would focus on different sports. But that's expensive. The app wouldn't have been expensive, but it would have been expensive to chase after those customers, those players that we are not currently chasing after. There's an economy of scale, right, to chasing after customers that are similar to each other. Just to give you an example, we sponsor, small cricket clubs. That's not going to help us at all with somebody who's a basketball fan or who's not Indian, or not South Asian, because basketball fans generally, on the whole, are probably not very interested in cricket. So yeah, like I said, focusing on things that kind of playing to your strengths and deciding that you're not going to try to do something different is just as important, in my opinion, as, figuring out what your strengths are and then, and focusing on those. Like the things that you don't do I think is important too, especially when you're a small company. We only have 35 employees.
Yeah, and also sometimes you get distracted, right? The excitement of chasing something that sounds like, oh, wow, like let's go after horse racing. Well, TVG's there and they've got the whole enchilada already set up. Or like you said, you got basketball, baseball, football, FanDuel, DraftKings. All of these big companies are already there. So you're trying as a small business to find that real niche where you can play in and,
100%. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Do you have partners in this business? I'm sure you are. Do you do this yourself? or how's the structure of this company? Do you have partnerships or?
So, I mean, we focus on building the software and finding the customers. And when I say building the software, I mean building the fantasy sports software. So in the UK, we have a license for gambling, so sportsbook, in which we are active. But we did not build that software. We basically use someone else's software. They take a commission, and their software is embedded into ours and is rebranded, so it looks like it's ours. But just as an example, doing sportsbook, doing betting requires a lot of technology, which we didn't want to develop, and it's a lot cheaper to buy it from somebody else. So in that sense, we have partners. We have, kind of software technology partners that provide different types of products that we can then resell effectively. We have, partners that we use for compliance, because doing compliance by yourself is really hard. So we have partners that help us, have a registered agent, in the state of wherever, Virginia, because you need a registered agent. Like, we don't have somebody in Virginia for that. But we don't have partners in the sense that there's nobody that resells our product, if that's what you mean.
Well, what I mean is, when you say we, who's we? Is it you and a few other people, or you do this all yourself at the top of the chain?
Yeah, I mean, there's a company. The company there are subsidiaries in different countries, because you need a UK company to open a UK bank account, but basically everybody works for the U.S. holding company. They don't always get paid by the U.S. holding company. That depends on different, kind of legal and fiscal issues. But yeah, there are 35 people building the software, doing the marketing, maintaining the operations.
Is there one overall owner of the company? Or?
No. There are about, I think, 10 or 15 shareholders. There are 3 principal shareholders. We sold some shares to get some funding initially, but it's all kind of family and friends level.
Well, that's what I want to get into for our small business listeners, because when I built my company, first thing I said, Aaron, and I'm not saying that it's the right way to go. For me, I said, one thing I don't want is friends and family in my business. And the second thing I don't want is partners, because I don't want to ruin my friendships, number one, but also, and family friendships and things. But also, I don't want to have to consult with someone else on it. Now, did it hold me back from building the company fast? Or I could have scaled it, as we talked about, in a much faster pace. Did it cost me some bigger opportunities to scale it? Absolutely it did. Do I regret not ever taking a partner or borrowing money from friends and family? No, I don't. I mean, whatever I built, I did it myself. So I just want to talk to you a little bit on a small business perspective about that, which is the intent to partner with people, which you did a couple times and it didn't work, as you referenced earlier in the podcast. And then now, where it does work, but here you are again with 2 or 3 key investors.
Well, I mean, there are 3 main shareholders. One of them is the subject matter expert I mentioned before. The second is our CFO, who lives in India and manages our development team, and many of our other employees who are in India. And there's myself. So really, it's only 3 people. The other shareholders are people that gave us money but had no expectation to be involved in the business at all. And we get along fairly well. I mean, there are always conversations and discussions and arguments about what the right strategy is, for instance, because no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. But we get along well enough. And we also have completely different expertise, in the sense that the CTO, who is in India, knows a lot about software development, but he's not really he doesn't have kind of like a holistic view of where the product should be going. The CEO, that's not me, that he's the subject matter expert. He knows a lot about fantasy sports, and he has lots of good ideas about what the product should look like. And I'm more about kind of make sure that things are operating, the right way. Are we doing compliance in the right way? Is the business running the right way? Are we doing customer care? And so I think we generally have a good relationship and don't step on each other's toes. And generally it's like, yeah, I hate doing that thing, you do it. And I'm like, I hate doing the other thing, you do that. So I do agree that having, your aunt telling you how to run the business is probably not a great idea. That said, if you can find people who are interested in investing and, are willing to just be silent investors, which we have done, then I think, getting some outside funding can be helpful. Obviously, you're going to have to share the pie when, the objective is to sell the company. And when that happens, they're going to get their cut. But that's fine.
Back off topic a little bit. I was just thinking about this. We keep talking about, or I do, DraftKings, FanDuel, and those type in the U.S. for those things. But what about in UK? Is Ladbrokes and all those kind of companies in London, are they also in cricket, or they only do horse racing and all that?
They are in cricket, but they don't really do fantasy sports. They just do straight up, what's called sportsbook, so betting. And gambling has been legal, and not just legal, but also they've had a legal framework around how gambling should work. They've had a licensing process and a compliance process for, I think, 40 or 50 years. I mean, obviously it's evolved over time, but gambling is a much more, started a lot earlier, or, official gambling started a lot earlier in the UK than it did in the US, right? In the US, Massachusetts legalized gambling, I think, last year. But so, yes, they are all involved in cricket, but, football is probably bigger than cricket. There's auto racing, and there are other things. And the other thing that they, like I said, they don't do is they don't do fantasy sports. And with fantasy, having a lot of people who are going to participate in a fantasy contest means that you can make the contests bigger, as opposed to sportsbook where, one person could bet, 10 people can bet, 1,000 people can bet. Each individual doesn't care how many other people are betting, other than the fact that it may change the odds slightly.
Just for my clarification, what's the difference between a regular sports book like Ladbrokes runs or something and a fantasy sports book? I'm a little bit confused there.
So a regular sports book is just me as an individual, placing a bet with Betfair, and there are odds, and I'll bet that I don't know, India will win the Cricket World Cup, and if India wins the Cricket World Cup, I win my money. If not, I lose my money. That's sportsbook. Fantasy is India is playing the UK in a T20 World Cup match. Or England, sorry, in a T20 World Cup match. I, as a fantasy sports player, select 6 players from both teams, okay? And based on the performance of those 6 players during the actual match, my players win points. So if a player makes a catch, that's 3 points. If a player bowls, hits a wicket, that's 4 points. I'm making it up, but something like that. Based on the performance of my players, my 6 players in this case, my fantasy team gets points. There may be 1,000 other people with 1,000 different fantasy teams. Their teams are also getting points based on the performance of the players on their fantasy teams in the real match. And at the end, whoever's fantasy team has the most points, wins a prize. Wins money.
So it's kind of like my fantasy football, where I have a draft, I select players, so it may not be selection of all the players, but it could be a combination of things. But you basically build your own team, and it may not be just from Leeds. It could be one guy from London player, one guy from Manchester in the league, one guy and you put them together, and then it's a performance versus other players. So it's not a straight bet like, okay, England versus Sri Lanka and 5 wickets will be taken. So it's a different kind of setup. You do the traditional kind of players book too, like just a straight.
We do sportsbook in the UK only, because that's the only location where we have a license to do that. Licenses in the US for that are extremely expensive, and so we probably wouldn't have the volume enough to justify getting a sportsbook license for New Jersey. Whereas if we were doing football, so many people bet on football that it might be worth it, but then we'd be competing with DraftKings and FanDuel, and so again, we probably wouldn't be successul.
So you cannot just get a sportsbook license for just cricket. Then it would have to be an overall license. Is that what it is?
Correct. Yeah. You get a betting license, and then you can take. There are certain things you're not allowed to take bets on, but effectively every sport and all kinds of other stuff you can take bets on. I think in the United States, betting on political outcomes of political races is not legal, but other than that, you can basically do anything you want. And in the UK, we have a license to do that.
So we have a few minutes left. If I had to ask you like one thing that you feel is going to make this business successful as it relates to small business, what could you tell our audience? Like what's the one thing that you think you're going to bring to this table long run to make this successful?
I think we have a great team, and I think having a great team is incredibly important. People who are committed are hard to find. Well, skilled people who are committed are hard to find. And building a team of skilled people who are committed and work well together is difficult to do. But if you can do that, if it's a startup and you have an idea, it doesn't have to be the best idea that anybody's ever thought of, and it doesn't even have to be a really original idea. But if you can execute on that idea because you have the right people to do that, you have a good shot at being successful. Of course, there are all kinds of other things happening external to your business in the world, competitors, legal things, financial things. But having a team, in my opinion, is probably the biggest factor in terms of success for a business, for a small business.
And this team is what, mostly in India, the people who build?
That's correct. Mostly in India, yeah.
And you've got people there at a high level, as we just discussed.
We do.
That helps in managing that team and so on.
Our CFO, our Chief Financial Officer, used to work in Deloitte doing accounting and audits for U.S. companies in the United States, but he was living in India and working in India. So we hired somebody who in the United States would probably cost $500,000, but he costs, less than 10% of that. And he's happy with his salary. So yes, one of the other things about our business that I really like is we're 100% virtual. There's no office. Nobody goes to the office. There's no commuting, which means that we can source talent from anywhere. And we do. We have employees in the UK. We have employees in India. We have employees in Pakistan. We had employees in Australia when we were looking at Australia. It gives you a lot of flexibility. But again, I think come back to the original point, building a good team, a team that works together and is collaborative and has the skills and is committed. I would say that's the single most important factor in terms of success.
That's great stuff. I guess we have to do a whole other podcast about the benefits of working from home versus making people go back to the office. That's a whole other show for a whole other time. That's what's happening here right now. There's a lot of debate on that, sending federal employees back to work. And hey, getting back to this in the minute or so we have left, how can people, especially in the US, UK, wherever they're listening, find your app, find you guys?
So it's you can download it for free from the various app stores. It's called GullyCricket. GullyCricket is sort of like the cricket equivalent of stickball, like kids in the street playing cricket. So if you just search GullyCricket on the Google Play Store or the iOS App Store, you'll find it.
So that's what GULLY, GullyCricket.
Right, like cricket being played in a gully.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Aron. I really appreciate you coming on our podcast today on small business horsepower. Hope to have you back on a future program, and we really enjoyed our conversation today, so thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.